My parents gave my brother so much attention that they even neglected me on my wedding day. That was my final straw. 10 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my father texted me that he would not be there to give me away. My brother Ethan had called from a bar, saying his girlfriend had left him and he was not safe alone. Dad drove across town to get him. Mom went too because she said Ethan needed both parents. Neither of them answered when I asked whether they would return before the ceremony. I walked down the aisle with an empty seat on each side of the front row. 3 hours later, my parents arrived at the reception with Ethan between them. Mom asked the DJ to stop our first dance because Ethan was having another panic attack. Dad then told my husband that family should matter more than a schedule. What my parents didn't know was that my cousin had already shown me a video recorded at the bar. Ethan wasn't abandoned, alone, or in danger. He had been laughing with friends while timing how quickly Mom and Dad would leave my wedding to rescue him. That video answered a question I had been asking my entire life. It also ended my relationship with all three of them. My name is Natalie. I'm 30, my husband Daniel is 32, and my younger brother Ethan is 27. If you ask my parents, Carol and Stephen, they will tell you they love us equally. What they mean is that they love us differently because Ethan has always needed more. Ethan was born with asthma and spent several nights in the hospital as a toddler. I was 6 when he had his worst attack. I remember Mom leaving my school play halfway through because Dad called from the emergency room. I was frightened for Ethan, not angry. At that age, I understood that breathing mattered more than a play. The emergency passed, but our family never left emergency mode. When Ethan was healthy, my parents still treated him as fragile. If he forgot homework, Mom drove it to school. If he fought with friends, Dad called their parents. If he quit a team, the coach had failed to encourage him. Any consequence could supposedly damage his confidence. I became the reliable child. I packed my own lunch, completed forms, found rides, and stopped announcing problems unless I had already solved them. My parents praised my independence, which sounded like love until I realized it was permission to ignore me. At 14, I won a regional science competition. Mom missed the award ceremony because Ethan had lost his phone and was too upset to search for it alone. Dad came but spent most of the ceremony calling stores Ethan had visited. When my name was announced, Dad was in the hallway. At 17, I broke my wrist during volleyball practice. I sat in the school office for nearly 2 hours because Mom was helping Ethan prepare for a math test. A teammate's mother finally drove me to urgent care. Mom later said she assumed a broken wrist could wait because I sounded calm on the phone. That sentence became the rule of my childhood. If I did not collapse loudly enough, I did not require care. Ethan noticed the pattern and learned how to use it. I don't think he began as a cruel child. He was taught that distress brought attention, and accountability made distress worse. By high school, he could turn any event into a crisis. If I had friends over, Ethan suddenly felt excluded. If I celebrated a birthday, he remembered something painful. If our parents tried to say no, he threatened to leave, fail school, or stop speaking to them. Mom called him sensitive. Dad called him complicated. I called him exhausting, but only in my head. I moved 3 hours away for college and built a quieter life. My parents called mostly when Ethan needed advice, money, or a place to stay. When I graduated, they arrived late because Ethan had overslept and refused to drive separately. They missed my department ceremony, but made it in time for photographs. Mom posted those photos online and wrote about how proud she was to have supported me through college. I had paid my own rent, worked 2 jobs, and spoken to her less than once a month. Daniel and I met when I was 26. He was the first person who noticed how often I minimized disappointment before anyone could tell me I was unreasonable. If my parents canceled dinner, I said it was fine. If Ethan borrowed money and ignored me, I said he was struggling. Daniel never insulted my family. He simply asked why understanding them always required abandoning myself. When we became engaged, I almost wanted a courthouse wedding. Daniel has a large, affectionate family, and he dreamed of celebrating with them. We agreed on a small wedding of 80 guests at a restored farmhouse outside the city. I told my parents one thing before we accepted their offer to help. The wedding could not become another Ethan emergency. Mom looked offended and said, "Your brother would never ruin your wedding." Dad added, "You need to stop expecting the worst from him." Ethan was dating a woman named Brooke at the time. They had been together for 8 months and argued constantly. 3 days after our engagement announcement, Ethan called Mom saying Brooke might leave him because seeing my happiness made him question his life. Mom repeated this to me as though my engagement had somehow injured him. During wedding planning, the pattern continued. Mom missed my first dress appointment because Ethan needed help moving a couch. She left the tasting early after he called about a leaking sink. Dad forgot to pay the deposit he had volunteered to cover because he had loaned Ethan money for a car repair. Daniel and I stopped relying on them financially. We paid the deposit ourselves and reassigned every important task. My parents remained ordinary guests, except that Dad was supposed to walk me down the aisle and Mom was scheduled to give a short toast. I created backups for those roles too. My Aunt Diane agreed to walk with me if Dad was late. Daniel's sister Priya kept a copy of the toast schedule and knew she could remove Mom's speech if necessary. Some people may say planning backups meant I already knew what would happen. They are right. I knew there would be a disruption. I did not believe my parents would abandon the ceremony entirely. 2 months before the wedding, Brooke ended her relationship with Ethan. He called Mom every night for a week. Then he and Brooke reconciled, broke up again, and reconciled again. I asked Ethan directly whether he could handle attending the wedding if they separated. Ethan told me, "Not everything is about you just because you're getting married." I said the question was specifically about my wedding. Ethan accused me of treating his mental health like an inconvenience. I told Mom about the exchange. She suggested allowing Ethan to bring a friend in addition to Brooke so he would have emotional support. Our guest list was fixed, and I refused. Mom sighed and said, "I hope you can live with being this rigid if something happens." That felt like a warning. 1 week before the wedding, Brooke confirmed she would not attend. She privately messaged me that she and Ethan were no longer together and asked me not to place them together in photographs. I thanked her and adjusted the seating chart. Ethan told our parents that Brooke had blindsided him. Mom asked whether we could postpone the wedding by a month. She said Ethan might find the ceremony triggering while his own relationship was failing. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I told Mom the wedding would proceed and Ethan was free not to attend. Mom accused me of excluding him at his lowest point. Dad later called and asked me to apologize for sounding cold. Instead, I sent both parents a clear message. I said I loved Ethan, but no one would interrupt the ceremony or reception to manage his breakup. If he felt unable to attend safely, he should stay home and contact a qualified professional. I also wrote that anyone who created a scene would be asked to leave. Dad replied, "Understood." Mom sent a thumbs up. The morning of the wedding was calm until 1:20 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled for 2. I was dressed, the photographer was taking pictures, and Dad had texted that he and Mom were 10 minutes away. At 1:27, Ethan called Mom. I learned later that he said he was at Murphy's bar, intoxicated and thinking about doing something reckless because Brooke had blocked him. Mom told Dad to turn the car around. At 1:34, Dad texted me that they had an emergency. I called him immediately. Dad said Ethan was alone and possibly in danger. I asked whether they had called emergency services or a crisis line. Dad said involving strangers would humiliate Ethan. I reminded Dad that he was supposed to walk me down the aisle in 26 minutes. Dad told me, "Natalie, you are surrounded by people who love you. Your brother has nobody right now." I said Ethan had friends, a mother, a father, a therapist he had stopped seeing, and access to emergency help. Dad said he did not have time to argue and ended the call. Mom did not answer me at all. For about 30 seconds, I felt 6 years old again, waiting backstage while Mom ran toward Ethan. Then, Aunt Diane took my phone away and asked what I wanted to do. I wanted to cancel everything. Daniel found me before I made that decision. He told me the front row was full of people who had arrived because they wanted to witness our marriage. He said we could delay, cancel, cry, or walk down the aisle together. The choice was mine. I chose Aunt Diane. She walked beside me while the seats reserved for my parents remained empty. I did not look at them after the first few steps. Daniel's father quietly moved into one of the seats before the vows, and Priya sat in the other. The ceremony was beautiful. That almost made the absence hurt more. I was happy, and part of me was still listening for the farmhouse door. My parents missed the entire ceremony, family photographs, and most of dinner. At 4:53 p.m., Mom texted that they were bringing Ethan to the reception because he needed to be around family. I replied that Ethan could attend only if he was calm and sober. Mom said he had stopped drinking more than 2 hours earlier. Our coordinator, Melissa, met them at the entrance. Ethan was unsteady and argumentative. Melissa told Mom he could not enter. Dad insisted the family had paid for part of the wedding, which was no longer true because Daniel and I had covered every unpaid amount. While they argued outside, my cousin Lucas approached me with his phone. Lucas had been at Murphy's bar before the ceremony. He had assumed Ethan was simply meeting friends. The video Lucas showed me had been recorded at 1:18 p.m., 9 minutes before Ethan called Mom. Ethan was seated with 3 friends, laughing and drinking. One friend asked whether his parents would really leave the wedding. Ethan looked directly toward Lucas's camera and said, "Watch. If I use the right words, Mom won't even let Dad finish the drive." Another friend asked whether Ethan felt bad. Ethan answered, "Natalie always lands on her feet. She'll get over it." There was no visible crisis. There was a performance built from words he knew our parents could not ignore. I sent the video to Mom and Dad while they were still outside. Then I told Melissa that Ethan was not allowed in, and my parents could enter only if they stopped arguing and did not mention him. Dad came inside alone. He approached Daniel during our first dance and asked him to stop the music so the family could discuss what had happened. Daniel refused. Dad raised his voice and said, "Family should matter more than a schedule." Our guests heard him. Daniel's father escorted Dad outside before security had to intervene. Mom never entered. She stayed in the parking lot comforting Ethan, even after watching the video. We continued the reception. Priya gave a toast. Aunt Diane joined our parent dance, and then Daniel's parents invited everyone onto the floor, so the moment felt celebratory rather than pitiful. I did not cry until the hotel room that night. I cried because my parents had missed my wedding, but also because the video removed their favorite excuse. Ethan had not experienced an unpredictable emergency. He had tested his power, and they had proven it. The next morning, Mom sent a long message saying Ethan's behavior was wrong, but his intoxication meant they could not safely leave him. She said the real problem was my refusal to postpone after his breakup. Dad apologized for missing the ceremony, but said he would make the same choice again if one child appeared to be in danger. He did not address why neither parent called professional help or why one of them could not return. Ethan sent, "Sorry your day got messed up." He added that Lucas had recorded him without context and claimed he had only been joking. I responded once. I told all 3 of them that I was taking an indefinite break from the relationship. I said emergencies would no longer be used to demand access to me, my time, or my future children. Then I blocked them before leaving for our honeymoon. Mom contacted relatives and described me as a bride who cut off her family over a delayed arrival. I sent the video and our message history only to people who directly pressured me. Most stopped contacting me after seeing them. 2 relatives still said a wedding was only one day, and I should not destroy a family over it. They were right that it was one day. They were wrong that the decision was about one day. It was about the school play, the science award, my broken wrist, graduation, the dress appointment, the tasting, and every moment I had been called strong, because strength made neglect convenient. 3 months later, Dad appeared at my apartment. He said Mom was devastated and Ethan had entered therapy. Dad asked what they needed to do to fix things. I told him the first step was acknowledging that the wedding choice had been theirs. Ethan had manipulated them, but they had chosen to turn around. They had chosen not to call professionals. Mom had chosen to remain in the parking lot after seeing proof of the lie. Dad had chosen to interrupt my first dance. Dad said he could apologize for the outcome, but not for trying to protect his son. I told Dad that answer meant nothing had changed. Then I asked him to leave. 6 months have passed. Ethan is apparently still in therapy. My parents send letters through Aunt Diane, but I have asked her not to summarize them. If they eventually accept responsibility without asking me to erase the consequences, I may reconsider limited contact. Daniel and I are happy. Our wedding photographs are beautiful. In the picture taken before the vows, 2 front row seats are empty. I used to hate that image. Now I see Priya and Daniel's father moving toward those seats in the next photograph, filling the space without being asked. My parents believed I would always land on my feet, and I did. That does not mean they were entitled to keep knocking me down. There are details I keep returning to when I question whether cutting them off was too extreme. At my bridal shower, Ethan called to say his car had been towed. Mom left while I was opening her gift, and Dad drove her across town to help him. The car had not been towed. Ethan had forgotten where he parked after a concert. Mom said the distinction did not matter because his fear had been real. At the rehearsal dinner, Ethan arrived 40 minutes late and announced that seeing happy couples was difficult after his breakup. Mom asked Daniel's parents if we could remove a planned toast about marriage because it might upset him. Daniel's mother politely refused. Mom spent the rest of dinner sitting beside Ethan instead of participating in the rehearsal. Daniel asked that night whether I wanted Dad removed from the aisle plan. I refused because I wanted to give my father one uncomplicated opportunity to choose me. In hindsight, I had built part of the wedding around a test Dad did not know he was taking. I was still hoping the importance of the event would transform people who had ignored every smaller occasion. Brooke had warned me too. A week before the wedding, she said Ethan blamed my ceremony for their final argument. He wanted her to attend so relatives would believe they were together. When she refused, he said she was humiliating him. Brooke explained that whenever Ethan made vague statements about having nothing left, she offered to call a therapist or crisis service. Ethan always accused her of overreacting because what he wanted was her presence, not professional help. I sent that warning to Mom. Mom dismissed Brooke as a bitter ex-girlfriend. After the wedding, Aunt Diane apologized for years of telling me that parents naturally gave more attention to the child who struggled. She said watching me walk into my ceremony without either parent made the pattern impossible to minimize. Her apology mattered because she did not ask me to forgive anyone. She simply named what she had seen. Our photographer also sent a sequence I had not noticed. In the first image, my parents' seats were empty. In the next, Priya and Daniel's father were looking at each other. In the third, they were moving into those seats before the vows began. Love did not make a speech. It saw an absence and quietly filled it. Ethan later posted online about people weaponizing someone's lowest moment. Several friends from the bar supported him until Lucas replied that Ethan had planned the call before he appeared distressed. Ethan deleted the post. Mom mailed us an expensive serving set with a note saying the gift proved she had always cared. I returned it unopened. I no longer wanted objects offered as substitutes for presents. 2 months after Dad appeared at my apartment, he sent his first letter that did not mention Ethan's needs. Dad admitted he had known Mom could stay with Ethan while he returned for the ceremony. He chose not to return because Mom said leaving together would show a united family. Dad wrote that he had confused supporting his wife with abandoning his daughter. I did not answer, but I kept that letter. It was the first evidence that one of them might eventually understand. Mom's letters remain different. She describes how devastated she felt watching wedding videos afterward, as though missing the day were another painful event that happened to her. She asks whether I can imagine how impossible her choice felt. She never asks what it felt like for me to hear Dad end that call 26 minutes before my wedding. Ethan sent one email through a new address. He admitted saying the words in Lucas's video, but claimed he had become genuinely distressed after making the joke. That may be true. Manipulation and real emotion can exist together. The fact that he later felt bad does not erase that he created the emergency deliberately, or that he expected me to absorb the consequence. Daniel and I have discussed what limited contact might look like if my parents change. It would require family therapy, separate relationships, and a rule that threats of harm are directed to professionals rather than used to summon us. It would also require my parents to accept that forgiveness does not restore every role they lost. If we have children, Mom will not become a trusted grandmother simply because time has passed. Dad will not receive important responsibilities until he demonstrates that another call from Ethan cannot make him disappear. The wedding was not perfect, but it was honest. The people in our photographs are the people who stayed. The speeches came from people who celebrated us without first checking whether Ethan could tolerate it. For the first time, an event continued without reorganizing itself around my brother. That is why the wedding became my final straw. It gave me a complete picture of the family system and, at the same time, showed me that a different kind of family was already standing around me. I have also had to examine my own role honestly. I spent years saying everything was fine, and then expected my parents to understand that the wedding was different. My silence did not cause their behavior, but it allowed them to believe there would never be a consequence. Each time I accepted an apology without change, I taught them that disappointment was temporary and my availability was permanent. No contact is not a punishment I enjoy. I miss Dad's terrible jokes, and the version of Mom who called when she genuinely wanted to know about my day. I even miss Ethan sometimes. He can be funny and thoughtful when he is not competing for emotional oxygen. Missing them does not make the old arrangement safe. Our counselor has helped me define what reconciliation would require: responsibility without excuses, professional responses to future crises, and respect for boundaries even when Ethan is distressed. Most importantly, my parents would need to build a relationship with me that is not based on how little I demand. Until then, the empty seats remain an answer. They show where my parents chose to be. The people who moved into those seats show what I am allowed to choose now. Daniel and I recently printed one of those photographs for our living room. I chose the image taken after Priya and his father sat down, not because I want to erase my parents' absence, but because I want the picture to show the whole truth. 2 people left the space empty, and 2 others decided I should not face it alone. So, was I wrong to cut off my parents and brother after they abandoned my wedding for a crisis Ethan deliberately manufactured? Or was that day simply the first time I stopped allowing their emergency to become my obligation?